Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Our attendee numbers are starting to slow down. We're still a big group, but it's great to see everyone here. Again, if there's any technical troubles, let us know in the chat so that we can help you out. And welcome everyone to the NACE Continuing Education webinar series. We're really excited to present this month's webinar on improving access to Indigenous collections through classification and metadata. My name is Erin, and I'm a member of the NACE Continuing Education Committee, and I'll be moderating the session today and helping with question and answer at the end. I'm also joined by our other committee members who will be of help if there's any technical issues should they arise, and they are in the audience with you as well. And since this is a bit of a special event and we have attendees from all over and also with the subject matter of our presentations today, I hope to take a moment and acknowledge the land from which I'm speaking to you all from. I am based at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people, sorry, screen sharing, got lucky. Many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And I hope this is a reminder and maybe a reflection for you all of the many perspectives that we're bringing together in this shared virtual space that shape our understandings of the history of the land and our privilege to reside in these different places. And we're very lucky to be joined by our 4 wonderful speakers, Margaret, Claire, Jordan, and Julia, and you'll learn a lot more about them and their work with each presentation. So lastly, a bit of housekeeping is to make sure that we don't run out of time. We'll be answering questions live at the end of all 3 presentations. So you're welcome to use the Q&A feature if you have any questions in the moment, and our presenters may answer them through that Q&A feature, or we'll save them to the very end. And we'll also be keeping note of all the questions that were asked. So if we run out of time, we'll be sure to follow up with those important questions. And if you have more casual conversations or commentary, those can go in the chat. A lot more ephemeral, easier to lose, but please feel free to include your chats there and share any questions that you have. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, which is Margaret. You can go ahead and start sharing your screen and we'll get set up.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes, looks good.
And you can hear me. Okay, great.
Yes. Okay, take it away, Margaret. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name.
Stop you for just a second. We have somebody who is trying to raise a hand, and I just want to make sure that it's not technical difficulties. So let's just make sure that the person can. Kim. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No worries. Hello, everyone. I'll start my timer, so I'll try and keep time. My name is Margaret Joyce. I am an original cataloger at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm going to talk to you about a project that I have been lucky enough to work on for the past 3 years, Wai Hāpai, which is a project to create a controlled vocabulary, actually kind of an ontology for Hawaii-related material based on Hawaiian epistemology. I will say that I'm not currently in Hawaii right now. I'm in Chicago, but I am a settler in Hawaii, and sovereignty belongs to Kalahui Hawaii, the Hawaiian people. And you will see some of the issues that come up with what that actually means, sovereignty in knowledge, a little bit later in the presentation. But a little background about what we are trying to address and the previous work in the area. So as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you know on this call, Western models don't represent Indigenous ways of knowing very well. These ways of knowing are more relational and connected, and there's a lot of context involved. So this is the case with Hawaiian knowledge or Ike Hawaii. Controlled vocabularies typically rely on things like literary warrant instead of direct communication with experts and researchers. So not all kinds of knowledge is represented in those systems. The process of term creation is not transparent to most users of these systems. And oftentimes the meaning of terms are not clear, right? You can have an authority record for a term, but if it just tells you the term, you have to go to a secondary source to describe it to you, and that can change what the meaning and context is. So these are some of the things we were thinking about. Previous work in the area includes improvements and corrections to LCSH terminology, including changing the wording of Revolution of 1893 in Hawaii to overthrow. This work was done by Ruth Horie, a former cataloger at the University of Hawaii. Our principal investigator, Dr. Siobhan Matsuda, wrote her MA thesis on Hawaiian Knowledge Organization. So that was really important work for what we're doing, and she's continued with that work for a long time. And in the Inea'opu Ithaca report, Hawaiian librarians interviewed Hawaiian researchers about their needs. And one of the main takeaways from that report was the need to improve metadata for materials related to Hawaii. And then there was also the Lau'alau Ka'ike project that was led by two of the same leads on the Wai Hāpai project. And they began the development and application of a Hawaii-centric controlled vocabulary. So this is really what what we had when we started our work and what we've been building upon. So a little bit about our project team. So our project team is made up of librarians in the University of Hawaii system, led by Native Hawaiian librarians. So our principal investigator, as I said before, is Dr. Siobhan Matsuda, and we have co-investigators Anne-Marie Pai Kai and Keahiahi Long. I have been serving as the metadata specialist on the project, focusing on that sort of organizational part. And we also had another librarian at UH, David Gustafson, providing expertise in data visualization and evaluation. And he's still helping us with that, even though he has left UH for another opportunity. So our project is one of the things we really wanted to do was to co-create terms, to co-create this methodology, not to do it as just librarians, but to bring people who are interested in this knowledge and this research in. So our co-creators were vital to this project. We had 6 Loea consultants who brought different ike and experience to our discussions, as well as 3 technical knowledge organization consultants. And we met with them throughout the project, and their insight and advice was invaluable. We met they met 6 times with the Loea consultants and 3 times with the technical knowledge organization consultants. So really getting feedback at a lot of stages was really important to our work. We took our methodology from the mele or traditional song, Kawai Akane. This is a song that tells the story that there are different places where vai or fresh water is found. And we took vai here to represent forms of ike or knowledge. So knowledge can be found in many different places, and we have to search for it in many different places and see it in context. Each phase takes its name from a portion of the mele. So I'm going to focus on the work of 2 phases, phase 2 and phase 3. So He Vaipuna, where we talked about doing the co-creation framework, how do we make these things together? And then He Vai'unu, the praxis of co-creation, what does that actually mean to put these things together? So we co-created frameworks, domains, and terms, and applied them to over 200 resources. So when we were talking about the models of this project, we knew we needed to cover a lot of different areas of subject, and we couldn't cover them all. So we focused on 3 domains for this first project. Aina, or land, hana, or practice, and mo'ukuohau, or genealogy. Our priorities included making bilingual authority records, prioritizing Olelo Hawaii, highlighting the relationships between terms both within and across domains, and providing context for terms and concepts. So on the screen here, you can see the schema for the Aina domain, and you can see some of the terminology there. So information that would be included in these records includes inoa or name, kumole, which is source, ho'olu'ulumanau, which is description, and then we have hiona aina, which are different relationships between lands. So hiona aina is like a land type. Is it a mountain? Is it a hupua'a? What kind of place is it? And then we have these two other hiona aina terms, which deal with places that are contained within the place we're talking about and places that contain that place. So another way of thinking of broader or narrower terms, right? And then we have the olelo kuhi, which are the instructions. We really wanted to give the opportunity to provide more context to people when they're applying these terms. When is it appropriate? When is it not? That kind of thing. So that's one of the schemas. This is another one of the schemas. This is for the Hana domain. You can see there's some of the same fields. The natural language fields are the same, and we still have the ability to link out to other domains, right? So a Hana, which is a particular practice, might be connected to a specific place, or it might be connected to a person or a group of people. We wanted to have a system that could allow for that and have it contained in the authority record. But again, since we're doing different domains, they're slightly different. So we have some extra fields here, including lako, or the tools and materials necessary to do a particular practice, or lavena, the behaviors, the movements, and that kind of thing. This is the third domain. This is for mo'ukuahau, or genealogy, which is really important in Hawaiian ways of knowing. You really need to situate yourself. So this is the domain that we plan to include deities, people, and groups. So we know it's going to be a little interesting when we work on all of those. For this project, we just focused on akua, or deities, and their relationships to each other, as well as their relationships to the two other domains. But those are basically how we plotted out what information was going to be contained in our different records. And then how did we actually come to this, and how did we work it all out with our co-creators? So this is a model of how we created the templates for each of the domains and tested them using selected terms. This is something I created for, I believe, ACRL 2023, where we were going through our process. You will note that it is an iterative process, right? There's more than one draft phase. There's more than one evaluate phase. We're keeping going. And we had multiple drafts, and this included frequent meetings with our consultants and co-creators. Each pair of arrows represents a request for feedback to be incorporated at the next step, and still gathering and still seeing what works, what doesn't work, what is necessary, what's too much, what is the appropriate amount of information to have in these records, was something we are really still sort of investigating. And speaking of records, here are examples of our authority records that we created after the process I just showed you. Here we have one for each domain. So we have Mauna Kea, right, for the Aina domain, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that term, at least. It has been in the news. Then we have He'enalu for the Hana domain, so that's also known as surfing. And then Pele, who is one of the deities. And I know you can't see it very well in this screen. These are some very long records, so I'm just going to click on one of the links. And hopefully, after a minute. Okay, are you guys seeing the Mauna Kea? Yes, thank you.
Yes,
all right, so yeah, this is the full authority record that we have for it. So we have the different names, we have those relationship between places, and then remember, these are bilingual records, so we have the natural language fields in both languages. So we have the description in Olelo and in English, as well as the instructions. And then we have where it links to other domains. So in this case, this place is related to these deities and these different practices. You can notice that not all of them are linked right now because we're sort of planning out what are terms we're going to need later on. And so this is a way of collecting them and still including that knowledge here. And then we have our sources, and then at the end here we have what they were applied to in the application phase. So this can be books, but it can also be chapters and songs and stuff, because we really wanted to see what the application would look like when we weren't considering those, traditional 20% rules of subject headings and how things like that work. We wanted to test it out without that. So I will, let's see. Okay, we're back to the slides, right? Okay, great. All right. So yeah, so we do plan to have all of the authority records on our website and be viewable by the public. Right now, they're not all live. We're still working on that. Yeah, so that's about the authority records. But as you know now from listening to me speak, I'm defining a lot of these terms, right? We're prioritizing Olelo. We're prioritizing different ways of knowing and different specifications than what we usually have. So we knew that since we created our own ontology as well as our own templates and terminology, we needed documents to explain these to other people. So we have on the website as well, 2 sets of documents. The how to read record sheet is for anyone who is looking at the authority record that needs more context or information, or who is unfamiliar with the Hawaiian language terminology. More for users. And then we have the instruction sheets, which are part of our future planning to have additional contributors to the vocabulary that tell you how to sort of fill out these things. And right now they're both in English, but we hope in the future to have them in Hawaiian as well. And I realize I have 1 minute left. So this is a quick visualization of when we did the application, what it looked like to have the terminology, the resources and the terminology in LCSH versus Wai Hāpai, just to show that there's a lot more connections when we have the terms related to one another in there. Our project outcomes. So these are the things we did in the project. We made the 3 domains with 105 terms combined. We had 10 consultation meetings. We did a certain amount of application, and we had 2 roundtable meetings on Indigenous knowledge and metadata. And we wanted to make all of our work sort of transparent, and it's not easy to understand how to start this kind of thing. So we have the website up. And if you go to the project library page, you'll find more about the process of how we did things. You'll find like our workflow documents and the community agreements we made with the co-creators and that kind of thing to really sort of contextualize things. In short, there's a lot. Obviously, I could talk about this forever, but we have the website if you want any more information, as well as there's an article that I wrote with one of the co-investigators sort of early on in the process. So it talks about really more of the planning stages of what we did. And you can, of course, always email me and ask me for more information. And if I can't answer, I can find the right person to answer that particular question. I just wanted to thank our sponsors, IMLS, who funded this project, the University of Hawaii at Manoa Library, and the School of Hawaiian Knowledge at UH. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Margaret. That was wonderful. I loved the connectivity slide with all the different links and everything. Those slides will be shared out afterwards. The webinar's closed, so you all have all those great links and everything. And there are some questions appearing in the chat. Margaret, you're welcome to answer those in the chat, or we can move them into the Q&A module in Zoom so that we can keep track of them better, but we'll answer them live at the very end. So just so we're all on the same page. Claire, would you like to share your screen?
Okay, I'm just. Could you all see my slides?
Yeah, we're seeing the full slide now. Perfect.
Awesome. Right. Okay, well, thank you, Margaret and Erin. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Laurent, and I'm the Metadata and Discovery Librarian here at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in Surrey, British Columbia, Canada. I'm very honored to be part of this NACIC webinar, and today I'm going to be sharing our strategies at KPU Library in improving access to our Indigenous collection through classification and metadata. Before anything else, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Samiamu, Sawasan, Katsi, Kikite, and Kwikwetlem peoples. So in my short presentation, I'm going to be talking about our metadata-related strategies in the implementation of our Hukmayim Indigenous collection, specifically our implementation of a modified Brian Deere Indigenous classification system, our Indigenous authors local subject term project, and if there's time, I could talk about the thesaurus that we use at KPU and a little bit about our NACO work pertaining to indigenization. So before I get started, I thought I would give you some quick facts about KPU. So we are a polytechnic university with more than 140 programs. We have around 20,000 students annually, 5 campuses located in Metro Vancouver region of British Columbia, 4 libraries, 18 librarians, and 60-ish library technicians. 78% of our student body belong to visible minority groups. So in terms of our guiding principles, our motivation behind implementing the Brian Deere classification system is to move away from a colonial system into a system that prioritizes and privileges Indigenous knowledges and ways of being. This important work is supported both globally and locally. And globally, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm not going to read all of these articles, but the one that's specific to metadata here is Article 13.1, where Indigenous peoples have the right to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. Another guiding principle that we have is a recommendation from the Canadian Federation of Libraries Association, specifically recommendation number 5, which talks about decolonizing access and classification, and also integrating Indigenous epistemologies into cataloging practices and knowledge management. Locally, indigenization and decolonization is a big part of my university's strategic plan. So we have goal B1 here. And in my library, we also have goal 3, which is to indigenize library practices and inspire reciprocal reconciliatory relationships. Our other motivation behind it as well are the biases and limitations of traditional classification systems used in academic libraries. So for example, the Library of Congress classification system. As you probably know, there are limitations and biases specifically for Indigenous related materials. I'm not going to mention a lot, just a couple that's relevant to my presentation. And so one of the limitations of the Library of Congress classification system is Indigenous materials are classed in the E schedule or the history section, implying that Indigenous peoples are history and they no longer exist, which is not true. This is problematic in terms of retrieval of materials because all the Indigenous related materials, for example, things like education or medicine related materials are squeezed into this section, but labeled history. People won't actually think of browsing this section because it's labeled as history, but there's way more materials that you can find in this section. Another limitation and bias is the nations or the Indigenous nations or communities are arranged alphabetically in the Library of Congress classification system without some sort of relationality. And relationality is something that's central to the Indigenous worldview. And so when Indigenous ways of knowing are not represented in a classification system, this becomes problematic, as I've mentioned, as it makes the materials less findable and accessible. And so these reasons prompted us to review an alternative classification system, the Brian Deer Indigenous Classification System, to organize our Indigenous specific collection. So just a little bit of a background of the Brian Deer classification system. This classification system was developed by a Mohawk librarian, Brian Deer, from Kanawaki, located in Quebec, Canada. Brian Deer is one of the first Indigenous librarians in Canada. He developed the system in the mid-1970s while he was working at the National Indian Brotherhood Library in response to the limitation of the LC classification system. So this system is based on Indigenous knowledge structures and is designed to be flexible to fit a library's collection. So you'll see there's different versions of Brian Deer classification systems out there. And that's because those Brian Deers are custom or designed to fit a library's collection or a community's collection. There's no writing that exists from Brian Deer himself about this, but a growing number of libraries have been using his framework and publishing on it. And so this illustration is created by Ashley Edwards, who's a Métis librarian at SFU. And this is the idea or the concept behind Brian Deer. So Brian Deer centers on the Indigenous ways of knowing. So the Indigenous peoples or communities, and that's the inner circle here. And then languages and worldview. And as we move further away from the circle, you'll see it, I'll show you later. It talks about the colonial interaction of the Indigenous peoples to the colonial world. And so this is our Indigenous collection at KPU. It's called Hokwayam Indigenous Collection. Hokwayam means oral storytelling and hand communium language, which is the language of the nations whose traditional territories our university is built on. This collection exclusively features Indigenous materials by Indigenous authors only, emphasizing the importance of Indigenous peoples telling their own stories. And so I've listed some of the technical services related development processes. There's also other development processes that our Indigenous engagement librarian Rachel Chong have done for this collection. For example, developing the space and consultations within our partners and the community, but I'm not going to talk about that in my presentation. So in terms of technical services related development processes, so we are purchasing titles only by Indigenous authors for this collection. And we're also purchasing from Indigenous publishers. We've reallocated titles from our general collection from the LC E-class that would fit the criteria. So Indigenous materials that are previously classed on the E-class are moved here as long as they're by an Indigenous author. Anything else that are by a non-Indigenous author, we kept them on our E-class. And also this collection is organized using a modified Brian Deer Indigenous classification system. And so in terms of the implementation of a modified Brian Deer classification system, we decided to adapt Simon Fraser University's Indigenous Curriculum Research Center's Brian Deer version. This version was modified by Ashley Edwards in 2022, and Ashley is a Métis librarian at SFU Library. And so because our collection and SFU's collection are quite different, so SFU's collection focuses more on Indigenous pedagogy or indigenizing curriculum, while our collection is more about broader in nature, we decided to further modify their version of the Brian Deer. And so in our modification, we try and cut our materials or our call numbers by nations or communities when a material is specific to them. The cutter numbers will be taken from the B, C, and D class of the Brian Deer classification system. So B class is a class dedicated to the nations in British Columbia, where we're located. C class is for nations that are outside of British Columbia and North America. And D is for the nations for the rest of the world. And so this is our Brian Deer version 1 that you can access from our website. And I talked about cutter numbers. If you're not familiar what cutter numbers are, these are a combination of letters or letters and numbers found right after a classification number. And it represents subject names, titles, or other aspects of a resource. And so in our context, cutter numbers represent a specific nation or community if a material is specific to them. And so going back to the Brian Deer illustration, as I've mentioned, Brian Deer focuses on the Indigenous ways of knowing. And so this is the classification hierarchy of the Brian Deer. And so as you can see, the inner circle here represents the Indigenous peoples or communities, and that represents the topmost letters of the Brian Deer classification outline. As we move away from the center, we have languages and worldview. We also move down to the classification system. And then as we move further away, as I mentioned, it will represent the relationship of the interaction of the Indigenous peoples to the colonial world. And you can find it down here, for example, justice system, law and legislation, and so on. And so that's how this illustration is translated to the classification hierarchy of the Brian Deer classification system. And in terms of call number structure, our call number structure is pretty similar to the Library of Congress call number structure. We typically have a 4-level call number structure. So the first level is the modified Brian Deer class designator. Just looking for time here. Second level is the nation cutter. Third level is the author cutter. So just how we cutter our Library of Congress items. And then the last level is the publication date. We also have a 3-level call number and also a 5-level call number because we collect a lot of fiction books or picture books by Indigenous authors. And so we wanted our users to be able to find the materials directly within that author section. And so we added an extra layer of level, which is cuttering by title. Another feature that's unique to Brian Deer is the spatial relationality features, which means that nations that are geographically next to each other are shelved together on the shelf and not alphabetically. So as you can see, this is the map of the lower mainland of British Columbia. And so these nations are shelved together on the shelf. And I'll give you a way better illustration here. And so this is how spatial relationality works on the shelf. For example, neighboring nations, Coast Salish and Interior Salish are shelved together. So all the nations within the Coast Salish umbrella will have a prefix of BF. And then all the nations within the Interior Salish umbrella will have a prefix of BG. And so F and G are next to each other. And then within the Coast Salish umbrella, neighboring nations, for example, such as Katesik, Kwantlen, and Stolo, are shelved next to each other. So BFV, W, and X. And same thing with the Interior Salish umbrella. Shikpatmek and Clapamuks and Silks are shelved together, so BGB, BGC, and BGD. That way, these nations that are geographically close to each other are shelved together. So that's our Brian Deer implementation in a nutshell. Again, I can talk about this forever, but I don't have time. But that's basically how we implemented our Brian Deer classification system. The next portion here is our Indigenous Authors Local Subject Term project. And so we've started adding a local subject term for Indigenous authors. And so if a book is authored by a person who is Indigenous, or a chapter of an edited work is authored by an Indigenous, or a corporate author is Indigenous operated, we add a local subject term called Indigenous authors. And so for our print books, our catalogers, since we're doing them individually, our catalogers are adding them as we catalog print books. For ebooks, it's a bit tricky because they're done in batches. And so what I did was I generated a report of ebooks in our catalog, prioritizing perpetual access ebooks. And we have 3 library technicians working on each list and checking to verify if an author is Indigenous. And then they send us a list, and then our catalogers add it to the bibliographic record. And so currently we're focusing on titles authored in North America, and we're hoping to expand this project later on. And so in terms of marked fields, this is the fields that we add. So we add a 386 creator contributor characteristics field. So this one will stay on the record once it gets uploaded to the OCLC database. We put in a source code of LCSH because Indigenous authors is an LCSH term. We also add a 690 local field for Indigenous authors, and then a local series statement for our Indigenous collection. And this is what it looks like here. On your left is the back end view, and on your right is the public view. And these, the public view, these things are hyperlinks. So users can just click on them and they could retrieve more titles by Indigenous authors or titles in the Indigenous collection. In terms of thesauri that we use at KPU, we use a lot of them. So we use Library of Congress subject headings, but we tried to move away from Indians of North America for Canadian related materials. So we do not use Indians of North America - Canada, but instead we use Indigenous Peoples Canada or First Nations Canada. We made this change years ago during COVID, and it involved both global edits to our catalog and manual edits. And we've changed about 4,600 bibliographic records. We also load Canadian subject headings, which contains the updated authority records or subject authority records from Library and Archives Canada. And then in terms of the Indigenous community names, we use the UBC Weevil Libraries names for BC Nations. And then we're currently looking as well at the Nicholas First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Indigenous ontologies vocabulary to hopefully integrate to our catalog in the future. And then finally, in terms of Indigenous identities, we use the Homosaurus vocabulary. So if you're not familiar, Homosaurus is an international linked data vocabulary for LGBTQ+ terms. We found it really useful for things like, or terms like two-spirit. So for example, this is just a comparison of the two-spirit subject headings. Library of Congress only has 2 or 3 that you could use, while Homosaurus gives you more specific options to describe materials related to two-spirit term. This is just an example of our records. So we're not deleting the Library of Congress subject heading, but we're supplementing them with Homosaurus subject headings. So we've coded them 650 second indicator 7 with a source code of HomoIT. And then finally, in terms of name authority records work, we are a smaller library, so we don't really create a lot of name authority records, but we're part of the NACO funnel project. And so if an author doesn't have any name authority records yet, for example, this Indigenous author didn't have any name authority record, we try and create one for them. And so in this case, the author used their Indigenous name prominently on their work. So we use that as the main access point on their authority record. And then we add their English name as a variant title. And then we try and add additional attributes when we can, if they identified their nations. And of course, 670, which was our source of information. We also try and edit name authority records. For example, I think one of the members of our community noticed that Jody Wilson-Raybould had an Indigenous name and they didn't see it on their record. And so they flag us and I was able to add it to their NACO record as a variant title for their Indigenous name. And when we can, and I know this is very, it depends on your ILS, we try and add catalog facets so that our users are able to narrow down their results easily. So we try and add location code for Indigenous collection, subjects for Indigenous authors, and other filters in our catalog that can help them narrow down their search results. And then finally, in terms of impact, I ran a circulation statistics report just to see how well our materials have circulated. And so we started this project in April of 2022. And so I ran a circulation stats report until August of 2024. And so the materials that are in our Indigenous collection have circulated way more than their counterparts on the LC class E51 to 99. And we're actually pretty happy about that because that's our ultimate goal. We wanted our Indigenous users to use them or to see themselves reflected in our collection, and also our non-Indigenous users to navigate our collection using the Indigenous worldview. So we're pretty happy about that. And these are my references, and that is it. Marcy, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claire. We were coming up right into the 15-minute, but it was never a natural time to interrupt you because we could spend an hour talking about all of these things. I'll pass it over to Jordan and Julia with our last presentation. And Claire, there are some questions in the chat if you want to take a look at them. We might have time at the end to answer them, round robin, but they're there if you'd like. Okay, your slides are up. They look good.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to share some of the work of Indigenous Metadata Working Group within University of Toronto Libraries. My name is Julia Bori. I'm a cataloging librarian, and I work primarily with serials and French language collections. And I'm joined by Jordan, who co-chaired the working group for me. Jordan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Jordan Peterson, and I'm a research and scholarship librarian now at the University of Guelph. But one of the favorite things I've worked on is being part of the Indigenous Metadata Working Group. And so we'll get a little bit more into our specifics, but as we both mentioned in our bio for this session, we're also both settlers, but with very different backgrounds. And our group was also a combination of people from all over, both in terms of their own backgrounds, but then also in terms of where they worked at in the library. So I'll pass it back to Julia to give some more context.
Thank you. So our efforts are framed by Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which released its final report in 2015 and was created to acknowledge government-sponsored abuse in residential schools and to offer recommendations for reparations. And included in this calls to actions were protection and strengthening for Indigenous languages. The other call to action to decolonize access and classification came from Canadian Federation of Library Associations, as Claire mentioned earlier. At the University of Toronto, seeks to respond fully and faithfully to the challenges issued by the TRC Commission. Our focus must be on concrete action. And so as part of efforts to make university more accessible and inclusive of Indigenous students, U of T is covering the cost of tuition for students from 9 First Nations in Ontario. Within the library's collection diversity statement outlines some of the projects that we'll discuss today, including changing the display of problematic and offensive subject headings in order to support researchers using preferred terminology. And I will pass it to Jordan, as she was instrumental in this project. We should note that terminology in Canada is different than in the United States and Mexico, and generally between nations and between languages.
Yeah. Thank you, Julia. So the main takeaway really from our presentation, if you get nothing else, is that so much of this work is very relationship heavy. And so it requires a lot of learning and relationship building, which takes time. And it's really from this foundation that any other project work can be undertaken. So sometimes your work might be technical, sometimes social, sometimes a combination, but it really stems from having strong relationships and a real sense of learning and curiosity and participation. And we found this was summed up really quite well in a quote from one of our working group members, Desmond Wong, who said, "Relational accountability is a cornerstone of work with Indigenous communities to ensure that trust and agency are built into the research project, or in our case, metadata projects. Moving forward in a better relationship with more accountability would see libraries move forward in a more consultative focus and shift the scope of metadata work to include relationship building with Indigenous peoples." And so our working group, as mentioned, contains a lot of people. Their names are at the end of our slides. But we had some broad and kind of lofty goals and then some project-specific ones. So we focused on developing cultural competencies and knowledge through running sharing circles and learning circles, where we had readings like Decolonization is Not a Metaphor or Elements of Indigenous Style, so that people could get a broad range of topics that they're addressing and learn how to situate themselves in relation to that. We also focused on consulting with communities and participating in whatever capacity is needed and is appropriate. And then we also did things like work on our subject heading project, which I'll be talking about in a little bit more detail. So it was nice to have this group because we had catalogers, we had non-catalogers, and generally people were just really invested in this goal of improving access to materials that relate to Indigenous peoples and knowledges. And we want to be clear that improving access means that things that should be discoverable are, but also that we are not inappropriately exposing things that should not be shared with the general public. And that's a separate learning conversation that I think some of our colleagues have presented on in other circumstances. So with the subject heading project, we were getting feedback from our user community that a lot of the Library of Congress subject terms were not appropriate, were not making them comfortable. It was just not a good experience. And so we identified that there's a few ways that you can deal with Library of Congress subject terms. But for us, the solution that seemed to make the most sense was to mask the display of Library of Congress subject headings that were deemed to be offensive or inappropriate. And then also to add another subject term to ensure that they are indexed in our catalog, which we call library search. Our project included some steps such as surveying all of the library staff, testing our solution in the sandbox, and then implementing the changes and communicating that back outward. It is worth noting that we were getting this feedback anecdotally, but we weren't relying on our Indigenous community members to give us exact examples. We had heard feedback from the community, we were like concatenating it, and we were doing the research as well to make sure that we weren't unfairly burdening anybody, because a lot of this work is very low level. It is the most basic remediation that we can possibly do. And so in the next slide, I'm going to show you the terms that were deemed to be offensive or inappropriate and the ones that we changed them to. So you'll notice that some of them are ones that Claire also highlighted, such as Indians of North America, which we masked that. So instead it displayed as Indigenous Peoples North America. And then we also have others like Inuit, which provided a little bit more complexity because the Library of Congress uses Eskimo for approximately 5 distinct groups of people. And the term Inuit, which means people in Inuktitut, is not actually the word that would be used for some of these other nations. So we needed to make sure that we were replacing it only when appropriate, and not that we were replacing something that was potentially offensive and incorrect with something else that was just incorrect. So it required some researching and some learning, but we got to the place where we have a pretty nice display and we're able to keep our Library of Congress subject headings so we can keep advocating for that change to be global for everybody who is using Library of Congress terms. So very quickly, I'm just going to show you an example of what this looks like. Hopefully you now see a record of results in a catalog. Okay, I'm seeing some nodding. So what this looks like for our users is when they look at the details, they can see Indigenous peoples, South America, Andes region history, Mexico, South America, etc. But then when we go down a little further to display the source record, and I'll zoom in a little bit to make that easier, we still see those 650 fields that are from the Library of Congress, but we also see, so the masking took place only on those Library of Congress fields, but then on top of that, we've also got these additional 650s with the source being the University of Toronto Indigenous Metadata Project. And that second 650, the one from U of T, that one's the one that's getting indexed. So this solution isn't perfect. It does cause a little bit of issues when people try to click through for these longer subject strings. If they're looking by subject, they'll get no results because there's no record that actually contains this full string. But it does work for the ones that are U of T specific. So Indigenous Peoples South America will show all of the ones that have had this term added to it. So we do have more details. I'll go back to our slides. We have full code and project steps available on GitHub. We used to have a wiki through U of T, but I believe they've updated their documents, and so that might be available. But in the interim, we've put it on a personal GitHub. And so if you have any questions about some of the downfalls of this, but also some of the strengths, we're happy to answer them. And since we've went live with these changes, there's some new advancement in the world, including Library of Congress announcing that they're working on evaluating some of these headings. We use an ALMA and Primo VE system at the University of Toronto, and so there are also advancements in ALMA such as the DEI exclude list that have been released that could help as well. And we're also just continuing to look for new terms to include that would better improve our user experience. So I'm going to pass it back over to Julia. And we will be talking more about some of the other projects that have been going on.
Jordan, can you advance to the next slide of what we would like to focus on, since Claire already covered alternative vocabularies through that are available, such as CSH and NICLA. Would like to spend a little bit more time on a project to surface materials in Indigenous languages. United Nations has acknowledged the importance of Indigenous languages by declaring this decade to be the decade of Indigenous languages. And the role of Indigenous languages materials at university libraries continues to evolve from studying to supporting language revitalization efforts. Next slide. So as Jordan mentioned, we have members of the working group. Some of them are Indigenous, some are passionate about linguistics, area studies, language learning. And across the system, we have catalogers with language expertise in some 55 languages. One of the catalogers took courses in Anishinaabemowin, and last year we had an opportunity to learn Kanyekeha, or Mohawk language, through a course that was open to all U of T library staff, so catalogers as well as user services. Our instructor led the sessions online from Ganawake near Montreal, and then came to Toronto for one in-person session. She spoke almost exclusively in Kanyekeha and introduced us to common phrases as well as understanding of the basic patterns and rules of the language. In addition, she also shared creation stories, governance and traditional governance structures, as well as cycle of ceremonies. The course was very useful in my work as I was tasked with cataloging the Eastern Door, a community-based newspaper serving the community of Ganawake that UTL recently acquired. Next slide. Our colleagues in collection development are using some of our metadata, specifically language codes, and they undertook a study looking at which Canadian libraries have strong collections in which languages. They used MARC language codes to compile data about holdings in several Indigenous languages at Canadian universities through WorldCat, and then analyzed this data to find meaning, find language collection hotspots, and compare collections. And based on the study, we started looking at a project to adequately describe the language represented in materials. Next slide. And we're using the ISO 639-3 language codes. This is an international standard on language codes and provides accurate and granular language information. It can be particularly useful for Indigenous languages that lack specific MARC codes. PCC recently created guidelines for the use of ISO language codes in conjunction in MARC records, and they suggest using them in conjunction with MARC codes. There are some limitations, so ISO codes cannot be used in 008, position 35 to 37, and there are some mapping issues. However, this, as I mentioned, can be very useful for the languages that lack specific MARC codes. And there are many of them for many areas of the world. Next slide. MARC standard uses collective codes based on language family or geographical region rather than language-specific codes. And specialists seeking to use materials in, say, Michif are underserved because the MARC language code that is assigned, that Michif is under, it's called Creoles and Pidgins, French-based, brings together materials from different parts of the Francophone world, from Martinique to Réunion to Michif language resources. Michif is the language of the Métis people. It's legally recognized Indigenous people in our constitution, along with First Nations and Inuit. It is still spoken in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and classified as critically endangered by UNESCO. Michif persistence, however, is one indicator of historical distinctiveness of Métis cultural traditions. So for this project, what I did was create a set of records that are in Michif. These are dictionaries, grammars, children books, religious text, and we've identified through 041 in conjunction with 546 language notes to ascertain that these materials do contain text in Michif. And based on this analysis, we've added the ISO 639 codes that you can see at the bottom of the screen. So we have a separate 041 with a CRG code with a subfield indicating that it's coming from ISO 639.3 to supplement the MARC collective code CPF, which you can see in the line above. It is a semi-automated process to facilitate working in batches that we've worked on with our discovery system librarian. And so if we look at the next slide, so hat off to Susan Bond for making Michif available as a filter in our catalog and also available through advanced search. So we are happy to share configurations that are needed to make this change happen in Alma. The trick was for the language code to be added to the customized language code table. Again, happy to share more information. So we are excited to and see potential for collaborative efforts between libraries. There are agreements being put in place in Canadian academic libraries to collect collaboratively. For instance, UTL will comprehensively collect in Anishinaabe-Mowin and Mohawk. Although we should note that our language collecting commitment is complicated because of the US-Canadian border splitting Haudenosaunee territory. So what I was wondering today is there an opportunity to collaborate to adequately describe language represented in collections? We are experimenting with AI to see if it might give us a hand with this in terms of language, ascertaining language and which language codes needs to be added from the ISO list, and potentially teasing out individual language codes from collective codes such as NAI, North American Indigenous Other, which is the MARC code. So I will end it here, and I hope we can open it for discussion. I know we're at the end of the time. So thank you, Miigwech, and we'll look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan and Julia. We have 1 minute left for questions, but it was great because everyone's presentations were full and so interesting. And lots of questions came through in the chat that I know Margaret and Claire have been around to answering. But if you have any questions for Jordan or Julia and you have a minute to spare, now is your chance. We'll hold here. And the slides will be shared out afterwards. Everyone had a lot of information on there that I'm sure would be a helpful reference, and you'll get those copies.
Can I just answer one question from the chat? Because there was a question from Allison about how our works by Indigenous creators first identified to prompt the application or verification for adding the subjects. And so there's two things for print books. Basically, the Indigenous engagement librarian flags them on the order record to add the Indigenous author's local subject term and other librarians. For ebooks, it's a bit much tricky because we've done them in batches, but I did run a report to capture titles containing keywords such as Aboriginal, Indigenous, other keywords that we put on the list, and then it spits out a list of titles, and then I just give them to the library technicians to actually go through each title and verify if they're Indigenous or not. And then we just get a list, and we get a list from the library technicians, and then we verify them again. The Indigenous engagement librarian verifies the list and then sends it to our cataloger who does the last verification, and then we add it to the BIP record.
Lots of steps. Great. You're getting a lot of kudos and thanks in the chat. And again, echoing that, what a wonderful program. It was really interesting to hear everyone's work. It looks like many are signing off, but we'll stick around for another minute if you have the time. And confirming, yes, the recording will be sent out once we close the webinar to all those who registered, and will also go up on our YouTube. And I'll share my screen here just to promote our YouTube archive of all the NASIG webinars that we've done in the past. You'll also receive an evaluation survey on how this went. And I want to highlight our upcoming webinar on September 24th, and it's digital preservation for books, and the registration link is here, and I will share it in the chat if I can manage it. But thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I'll just stick around until the very end.